Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. We all know what the German uniform looked like, right? We've seen it in all the war movies. Modelers can tell you exactly what colour the infantry uniforms were. They were Vallejo 70.830, field grey. Well, it turns out there is still a lot to discover about the uniform, its origins and even actually what colour it was. So joining me today is Dr. Stephen Bull. Stephen is the author of Osprey Publishing's Sumptuous German Army Uniforms of World War II. But before we get started, it's a big thank you to all those who support the podcast. $1 or so from people like you, loyal listener, help me find the time to put the show together. And you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2 podcast. I really do value your support, and where possible, I do try to make available extra bits and bobs exclusive for patrons. A bit more World War II chat, as it were. So that's patreon.com/WW2 podcast. Stephen, thanks for joining me. The classic World War II German uniform, if there is such a thing. I'm guessing in practice it only really existed, that classic uniform, stratified as it was in movies.
I think one thing that's very true about the Second World War uniform is that it wasn't actually designed during the Second World War, and the beginnings of it come from actually even before the Nazi period. They were beginning to redesign the uniform of the German army in 1932, and what comes out of this is the uniform that has the feld blues and the non-matching trousers, and that carries on right through until 1940-ish. So when we talk about a World War II German uniform, we tend to think of something which was actually started, or the design was started, well before the Second World War, and even just before the Nazi period.
Well, it's interesting because I did make a note to myself, or it's probably a great PhD question, is you're politicising uniforms and how countries view themselves as their uniform, because it's quite striking. It struck me as it harks back to an earlier period. I don't know what it says about the national character. There's that German tunic. We'd moved out of those style of tunics in the 30s. We were moving into the shorter battle dress, and the Americans followed, don't they, with the Ike jacket. Yet the Germans sort of clung on to that. I guess they modernised the First World War. Is it a modernised version of the First World War uniform?
Loosely, you could say that, but it is quite different because, of course, the First World War uniform has no pockets on the front, and the Second World War uniform has 4 patch pockets, and so it looks quite different, and all those pockets are pleated. So the appearance at first glance is almost sort of concertinaed, the Second World War jacket, whereas the First World War jacket looks very plain on the front.
It would be interesting to find a specification to see what they asked for the pockets and what they thought the pockets were going to be used for, if that makes sense. There's an interior pocket, isn't there, on the tunic?
Yes. Bottom right-hand skirt front, there's a little pocket inside, and that's for your field dressing. You're issued 2, and 1 or possibly even both can be crammed into that little pocket. And if somebody gets hit, that's where you're looking.
There's a Swedish version of that German jacket, and I had a Swedish version that's date stamped 1954. I worked for quite a long time. It was new stock kind of thing from some warehouse somewhere, and it had that little pocket in, and I wondered what it was for, because I just used it for putting my iPod in for 10 years.
Well, that's a nicer use in a way.
Well, it was a bit of, because obviously the British do the same thing at the top of the battle dress trousers. You carry your own field dressing. Everyone's doing the same sort of thing in a different sort of way. Now, had any consideration, when they're designing these uniforms, have any consideration been given to mass production? Because presumably, if there ever is going to be a war, they're going to have to churn these things out. So it has to be a consideration in design.
Well, they were made in the millions, but they were never really what I would call mass produced, because they were made in batches and they were still cut out by tailors on a table. The only really concession to bulk manufacture was that they would lay quite a few layers of cloth one over the other So when you pin the pattern on the top and cut round it, you were producing, 5, 6 jackets instead of one at a time. So you would have a skilled person who was the actual tailor or cutter, and they would cut out all the pieces. And then you would literally have a row of sewing machines, and the seamstresses would run up the pieces to make jackets.
Considering the tens of millions that must have been made, it's massively ineffective.
It is.
Inefficient, sorry.
You need a small army to produce the clothing for the larger army who's actually wearing it.
Yes. Considering that snappy look then that it sort of has, how tailored is it? Is it one size fits all?
No, quite tailored, if I can put it that way, because every one of those jackets has at least 5 measurements. So you know the chest size, you know the arm length, you know the back length, and all of them are stamped with that inside in a little pattern just inside the front. And those are the jackets for the ordinary soldiers, not the jackets for the officers, which really are genuinely tailor-made, just like going into a tailor and being measured and fitted one for one.
So that's something that when you see them in the war movies and all the uniforms fit, chances are, certainly in the early part of the war, all the uniforms really did fit. 5 measurements is a lot. I mean, I couldn't give you 5 measurements of my own clothes.
No, and you mentioned British uniforms earlier on. They tend to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And at one end of the scale, they're enormous, and at the other end of the scale, they're tiny. And hopefully, one of those is reasonably near what you are. When the German ones first appear and they're first fitted properly, they fit really well. It's when things go on and you lose your own jacket, or there's no longer those 5 combinations in your company store, things begin to go wrong. And they didn't just have one jacket either. Commonly, they would have 3 or 4. There would be the actual combat jacket, then probably the Waffenrock early on, or a good version of the combat jacket. And that would be the one you wore on parades and guard duties and things like that. Then apart from the combat one and that, there would be a drill costume, which would be essentially a lightweight uniform which you use for doing work, particularly dirty work. And that really would be a minimum 3 sets of uniform, and some people would have a 4th if they'd purchased their own. Did
that carry on throughout the war?
No. From the limited amount of study I've made on that aspect, because it's actually recorded in the soldiers' paybook when they get new uniforms, very often they've got 2 sets of combat kit and 1 set of drill kit, and that lasts for several years. But later in the war, when they get replaced, they get fewer sets. So towards the end of the war, you're finding that somebody's got the combat set and a drill set, and that's it.
If we look at the drill uniform, that's a canvas type affair, isn't it?
Yes. A lot of the German ones initially are linen. Linen you can get more easily in Central and Eastern Europe, and cotton is something that would have to be imported from somewhere else, which is quite a difficult thing to do during war.
The main uniform's wool. So when are they supposed to wear the drill? Does the drill uniform ever supersede one to protect the other? Does that make sense? Because my dad's coveralls were to protect his battle dress.
Right. It seems from the photographs and things that I've seen that they wear the whole set of one or the whole set of the other. It would be possible, I suppose, to put the jacket of one over the other, but that doesn't seem to be the planned use. And of course, the drill uniform being lighter and being made green later in the war made it viable as a combat uniform for hot weather.
Now, you mentioned green. We started to go down talking about colours. Obviously everything's field grey throughout the whole war, and there's probably a Vallejo paint colour for your models, which is exactly that colour. How much of a discrepancy is there? Because you're talking about it's almost a cottage industry producing these. How consistent is the colouring of the uniforms?
Not at all. And part of the reason for this is the different types of dye that they use. Part of the reason for this is that the quality of the cloth and what's actually in the cloth changes, and dye doesn't necessarily take well on different sorts of cloth. And then, of course, the drill uniforms are a different colour to the actual combat uniforms anyway. And the really big change right at the end of the war is the introduction of a thing called an EinheitsTuk, which is a universal cloth which they hoped, and this is surprising, they hoped would actually equip the combat troops of not just the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, but the SS as well. So this brown cloth, which is now, I don't think, really very well understood, it was intended for two purposes. One was that they thought this brown cloth, like the Soviet cloth that they met on Russian troops, it would be a better camouflage material than field grey. And the other reason was that with battlefield infrared being developed by the Germans, they discovered that their own uniforms were very visible under infrared. And when they did some research on it, they discovered that it was the indigo in the dye of field grey which really made their own costumes very visible under the light. And you might ask, well, what's indigo doing in field grey? It's because there is no green in field grey. What is in field grey are yellows and blues, which make the green, which goes in the grey. And the indigo, of course, is a very dark blue.
Is the field grey a hangover from the... this might be beyond the purview of this, but where did they get the field grey from? Is it a hangover from the old Prussian army?
Not quite. The first field greys come in soon after 1900 and are supposed to be less visible than the coloured uniforms that they used before. Since it's grey and it's intended to be used in the field, it becomes field grey.
It's interesting. We have that khaki. They obviously have field grey as their distinctive colour.
And it doesn't stay a monochromatic grey during the 1930s. By the 1930s, they are mixing these yellows and indigos into the dye, and so it does look green. It's the French expression of German troops, which is green fly.
The peculiar thing is, of course, so much of the Second World War is viewed in black and white photographs, you never quite get all these differences when you're flicking through books.
True, although quite a lot of colour footage has emerged in the last 10, 20 years, and colour photographs were taken of German troops during the war. And some of the big collections have got photographs in colour. And of course, the German propaganda companies during the middle part of the Second World War were certainly taking colour photographs to use as propaganda. Those give you quite a good idea.
Now, you mentioned that the Germans changed the material, which changes the way the dyes handle. So, I think most people think they used wool. And it's probably pretty straightforward. They use wool. Now, Germany's not necessarily known for its sheep.
No. And those that were landing up in the mutton stew, I think, rather than being kept to produce wool. Initially, the composition of the jacket was 90% or more wool with a small addition of rayon. But as time advanced, wool was more and more difficult to source, which meant that they began to use more recycled wool, or what we would call shoddy, and put that in with the new wool and increase the amount of rayon that they were putting into the clothes. In fact, some of the drill uniforms towards the end of the war were almost entirely rayon.
Where's rayon come from?
It doesn't sound very plausible when I tell you wood, but that's what it is. Initially, a lot of this wood was sourced from Sweden. So wood was being imported, pulped, and passed through these what they called Zellwolle factories, which was producing a surprisingly soft artificial silk.
I mean, wool has certain characteristics. If you get a good wool jacket, it's surprisingly waterproof. I've visions of wearing a wood-based cloth that turns to paper mache.
The industrial concerns that produced the rayon reassured the army authorities that they could produce rayon kit which was just as good as the wool. To some extent, they were right, because the rayon wore quite well, and as a lining or as a thread, rayon's great. But if you get it thoroughly wet, take it to Russia and freeze it, it's no longer anything like as good as wool. And of course, rayon clothes, when they were wet, they had very little strength, and they tended to misshape quite easily. And they didn't take the dye properly either.
Again, Field grey becomes, well, yes.
Field mush, yeah.
So if they've got problems just providing the materials to make the uniforms, how much modification do they do in the cut of the uniforms? Because if you look at the British battle dress, it enters the war with pleated pockets, and then they go to save on material as the war progresses. Does the German uniform go through a similar process of change?
Yes, it does indeed. And what you mentioned about the pockets is exactly the same on the German uniforms. They start off neatly pleated and everything's square and lovely, and then suddenly the pleats all disappear, so the pockets are just plain patches, and even the pocket fastenings, which begin with sort of scalloped edges and things like this, they go to just a straight line, so you've got a straight flap across the top. And the buttons at the front, they go from 5 to 6, because, of course, with this relatively weak rayon fabric, it's beginning to stretch open, and, I don't know, people's stomachs are gaping out and things like this, so you've got an extra button to hold it all in.
Did they, I mean, they do start to change their uniform quite radically by the end of the war, don't they? And I didn't make a note of the name of the uniform. It looks much more like British battle dress. It's a 1944 uniform, isn't it? It seems like a radical change. What's driving that change?
At least two things, one of which is the saving in time, money and materials. It's much easier to make. It's only got 2 pockets rather than 4, and it only comes down to just about your waist rather than somewhere on the thigh. So you've saved quite a lot of material and time for a starter. And the other one is that the 1944 uniform, which actually was a new pattern, was also intended to equip not only the Army, but the Navy, the Air Force, and the SS. But they never got round to re-equipping everybody in the same style.
It's funny because it suddenly looks much more modern than that the original uniform, which, as I say, sort of almost harks back to another century. Now, the other classic piece of I say furniture. It's not really furniture. Classic item of the German uniforms is the Jackboat. Was it a conscious effort to keep what do you call them, a Wellington, that high-legged leather boot? Because the British obviously have the ammunition boot.
It was a traditional piece of kit of the Prussian army, and its predecessors go right back to the early 19th century, and they are a characteristic piece of Prussian footwear. During the First World War, they continue to wear something very similar. And indeed, at the beginning of the Second World War, the boot is quite similar. But what we were saying about saving materials again, by 1939, they were shaving a couple of centimetres off the top. And the pair that I've actually got pictured in the book are only 32 centimetres high, whereas previously they were 35, 36 centimetres high. So you get this strange sort of shrinking effect of the height of the boots as the war goes on. And that's quite apart from the fact that they also carried a laced ankle boot, and the laced ankle boot became more common as the war went on.
Was it popular, the sort of the Jackboat? Is it a particularly practical design?
It's not as impractical as you might imagine, because if it fits well, then you don't miss the laces quite so much. And also, there was a strange thing called a Fuslappen, which you could wear with it, which is like a square piece of cloth, and you have it instead of a sock, and you wrap it round your foot. And if you get it right, and there's no ridges underneath, it lands up being reasonably comfortable. But it does take a bit of skill to get right.
And presumably they're in the same bracket as the, when it comes to production, as uniforms, not mass-produced either, sent out to small workshops across Germany.
They were made very widely, but unlike the uniform, a Fuslappen is quite simple. It's just a square of flannel, effectively.
Yeah, well, I was more thinking the boot itself.
The big problem there was the lack of leather, because leather was rationed very quickly, and getting hold of large supplies of leather wasn't that easy, which is one of the reasons for making the boot shorter, and also for going for ankle boots rather than full-length boots. But yes, they would have to be individually cobblered, if that's the right phrase.
Interesting you mentioned about the leather, because that brings to something I wasn't necessarily going to bring up, but I was thinking about load carriers earlier, and I got myself looking at the British 37 pattern webbing, which is sort of that canvas sort of affair with the ammunition pouches and things. Yeah, the Germans stuck with a leather
harness, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, A, why have they stuck with the leather, and B, is the leather actually more practical than the canvas, which is why they've stuck with leather?
I don't feel that the leather is really much more practical than the webbing. That's partly my subjective judgment, but leather does rot and stretch and malform. Webbing also does that, but to a much lesser extent. And you're quite right. The 1934 pack and the 1939 type strapping is really quite a throwback almost to the 19th century, because the First World War strapping and pack were devised in 1895, and the packs of the early 1930s really weren't that different. They were a modest advance on what existed in the First World War, but I think if Grandpa had come back from the First World War and put a Second World War one on, he wouldn't have noticed too much difference.
It struck me it being as remarkably flexible, that webbing. You hang all kinds of things in all kinds of way all over it. I hadn't quite realised it hacked back so far in that flexible.
Yeah, I think that was the significant advantage. It became more flexible through having the Y-shaped strap, which went over the shoulders and down to the waist belt at the back, and with two rings, one behind each shoulder, you could hang all sorts of things on it. Whereas the original pack with the integral straps wasn't quite as flexible.
Now, obviously, if you look at headgear, the British, well, they had forage caps going into the Second World War, and they've quickly all moved on to berets. But the Germans seem to have a plethora of headgear. Well, actually, I'm all right in saying they come out of the First World War with a universal cap, which is a bit like a beret, and then they go off piste and have all kinds of headgear.
The universal cap of 1917 had a peak, but it was like a baggy peaked cap, and it really was very flexible and quite simple. And during the 1930s, a number of different forage caps are introduced, including the peaked forage cap that's stiffly shaped, and the flat side cap, which is very much like the British one. When it really comes to serious combat, neither of those are particularly useful. So again, they're looking for a universal cap that's soft with a peak, and it goes full circle in a sort of 25-year period. Towards the end of the Second World War, they're wearing a universal cap again. And I can't help thinking that in many ways, if they'd stuck with the one of 1917 and just updated the materials as they needed to, an awful lot of time and trouble would have been saved.
Because it's funny, because that peaked cap they do come out with, it's a great looking cap. It looks really practical. You know, they've got the lighter version for the desert, but I couldn't help looking at it thinking it seems to have a lot of material in for a country that's trying to be careful on where it's putting its effort into making things.
Yes, there is an element of that, and that's one reason, like the cloth, they try and produce a universal cap so that they're not making lots and lots of different types of cap, as they were in, say, 1941. They're only making one sort of cap, albeit in different colours and potentially with different badges on it, in 1944 and 45.
Now, perhaps the most eponymous piece of kit of the German infantrymen is the Stahlhelm, which comes into being in 1916. Now, I'm sure my wife could have a glance at one and would never notice any difference between produced in 1916 and 1945. But is there much difference? Was it tested and changed throughout the period?
The answer to both of those points is yes, because although they do look fairly similar, there were several distinct efforts to change matters. The First World War one is different in that it has very prominent side lugs. And on those side lugs, they were able to hang a brow plate, which literally went over the soldier's brow. So you got 2 layers of metal, the helmet itself, and then a thicker piece in front, which was actually to some extent bulletproof, which the rest of the helmet wasn't. When they were redesigning the helmet in the 1930s, they not only changed the lining, but at one point they actually thought they were going to go with a fibre construction. That would have been very, very light, although not terribly protective. But in the end, they opted just to make the First World War model more streamlined, because that was not only an easier thing to do, but it maintained that continuity of this is a German helmet, and here's another German helmet, which looks quite similar. You can recognise that. Whereas if they had gone for fibre as early as the 1932, 1933 period, there would have been a change of all the helmets and all the material, and it might have been more difficult to recognise as being a German helmet.
I've often wondered about the development of the German helmet in the First World War. I've never managed to find anything on it. It looks like a helmet that's been designed with some thought.
The two men in the story are Schwerd and Beer. I forget which way round they are, but one of them's a medical man and the other one's more of an engineer. And the medical man had concluded that he was getting far too many young men with small holes in their heads. And it was put over to the engineer who determined the minimum amount of metal thickness and the maximum amount of head cover to prevent these very small injuries, which were putting a disproportionate number of people out of commission. It never was intended to be bulletproof. It was intended to be proof against as many different fragments flying around in battle as possible. So it was a brutally simple testing method. They stuck them all out on an artillery range once they'd devised them and simply bombarded them with artillery and saw which ones were least damaged.
Do you know how they came up with the design, the shape?
The shape, as we just said, was designed to cover as much of the head as possible, but also it had to avoid your backpack. So it could only go down a certain distance before you couldn't lie down and shoot at the enemy. And they wanted to avoid that. So the length of the back of it was limited by the extension of your neck when you put your arms underneath you to fire a rifle.
You're the first person I've ever been able to ask questions about helmets. I've wondered for a long time. And because I've read all kinds of stuff which I put down as being complete cobblers about helmet design, harking back to, the British one looks like it's because that's the helmet from Agincourt, and they make some connection with a German medieval helmet who'd been the traditional helmet. And I read a throwaway line somewhere that the Germans had actually bothered to design theirs, which is why they were the last to sort of bring out a helmet. But I've never been able to find anything about it.
Yeah, but I think there is some element of truth in harking back to medieval originals. I don't think we can put an awful lot of store on it, but that story was out certainly by 1930. There was an American author who did quite a good book on helmets and body armour. He produced a series of tables showing the shapes of the different national helmets and the shapes of the different helmets used by medieval knights 400 or 500 years before. So the story may not strictly be true, but it's been out there a hell of a long time. And when you see the drawings, you see there are similarities between German helmets of sort of 1400 and 1916.
Did that design have any flaws? That sort of original design, does the sort of the curtain round your ears, does it cause problems? Obviously, the British is the Brody Helmet sits much higher on your head, and you have. Was there any fundamental flaws with that design?
Yes, there were flaws, and specifically, you're quite right about the skirts going round the ears. There were quite a lot of people who said they couldn't hear properly when they had it on. But if I was given the choice between having my ears blown off and not being able to hear something, I think I'd settle for the not being able to hear properly problem. More seriously, in 1918, they did address this by producing the Stahlhelm with ear cutouts. So you've got a strange shape where the helmet rises up just over the ears, so you can actually hear what's going on, but it's a rather strange-looking helmet. That did survive right through until the 1930s. You occasionally see people in photographs still wearing this 1918 model with the ear cutouts.
does the design change much during the war?
No, not very much. But some First World War helmets were still in use right through the Second World War. This is one of the myths that I've tried to tackle in the book, that every time there was a minor change to a helmet, the model number changed. Collectors are obsessed with calling something an M40 helmet or an M41 or an M42, M43. In fact, none of those things ever existed. The Second World War German steel helmet, if in original documents a number gets mentioned, it's always 35. It's always the 35 Stahlhelm, which was the year the original came into use.
Does that mean the changes are simply to the manufacturer? Because there's differences on the edges, but essentially it's the same shape and everything else. There's just manufacturing, tinkering to make it more of a streamlined production.
Yeah. So there's the little changes to the grommets in the sides, and they come in about 1940. Although one of the manufacturers had actually thought this out in 1938. Then, yes, there's the whole business of the sharp edge and the soft edge of the bottom of the helmet shell. And the raw edge, as some people call it, came in mainly as a manufacturing saving rather than something to do with combat, because at the same time as these helmets with the unfinished edges appeared, the thickness of the helmet shell was made slightly thicker. And that wasn't necessarily to stop more things coming through it. That was done to make the metal easier to work. So you would produce more acceptable helmets from each batch and fewer failures where anything ripped or gave way while it was being made.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're just tinkering with the designs to sort of shave off all those little bits to aid production as things get scarce.
That's a theme which goes through all these things. The uniforms, the packs, weaponry, helmets, they're all made more and more simply and more cunningly with fewer and fewer materials as time goes on.
My favourite piece of German equipment, which I can't believe no one does today in gaudy colours and sells it as a festival thing, is the Zeltbahn. The Zeltbahn shelter poncho.
Oh, yes.
Come marquee if you have enough of them. Just absolutely baffles me. It's such a brilliant design. It's a triangular shape that you can wear as a jacket, a poncho, and a tent, essentially.
It's a piece of cloth which is vaguely waterproof, well camouflaged, and it's got enough buttons that you can use it in many different ways.
Brilliant. Where did that come from? Because it's not something I'd ever seen before. It's sort of an idea to me that I've never seen in this country before. You know, where did the Germans? Is it something that they had previously?
Shelter quarters certainly existed previously, and in the First World War they were rather plain and brown. So they did make multi-part tents as early as the First World War out of something like a Zeltbahn, but it wasn't until 1931 that somebody had the bright idea of printing them all with a camouflage design, at which point it became a raincoat, a poncho, and something to wear to camouflage yourself as well.
Now, that brings up another point. So they've realised, in the early 30s that, the usefulness of camouflage, yet they don't go down the route of making a camouflage uniform, but they put it on their poncho.
And I think that's true of most of the uniforms of most of the armies in the 1920s and the 1930s. I have great difficulty thinking of anybody who was putting spotty camouflage or brown, green and yellow stripes or anything on their costume. Really, I think that does kick off after war starts in 1939. It suddenly becomes deadly serious rather than just being a possible addition.
It's odd that they decided to put it on the poncho. It's just the little idea that struck me, let's pop it on the poncho. And then the idea's clearly there, but no one ever takes it any further for such a long period of time. As you said, war starts, and then people start thinking about making, coveralls and various other things that are...
The poncho Zeltbahn idea is there around about 1930-31, and they're not really making camouflage smocks until 1941. So you've got a decade where your tent is well camouflaged, but you're not.
Now, obviously, no troops are any use unless they're carrying their some sort of rifle. And we keep pointing out that some of this uniform is almost from another era. The German rifle dates back to 1898. I mean, it's essentially the same rifle they're carrying into the Second World War as they carried into the First World War.
Yes. The crucial difference is that it's a K98K, so it's a short carbine 98. The mechanism is exactly the same, but the length of the barrel makes it a carbine rather than a rifle. But the performance is quite similar, and it is a lot more handy than the First World War one, which is significantly longer in the barrel. You do notice a difference.
Was it comparable performance to the Lee Enfield? Was there any slight quirks to it that made it better or worse?
I think the Lee Enfield actually performs better. And if you've worked the bolt of both a Lee Enfield and a K98, the Lee Enfield bolt does feel smoother and move more easily. Two other things I would say are important. With the length of the Lee Enfield bolt pull, it's relatively short. So you can actually keep your eye on the target and keep the rifle at your shoulder and work the bolt at the same time. Whereas with the German one, the bolt is a little bit longer. And if you try and work it quickly with it in front of your face, you'll end up punching yourself in the eye. So there's a tendency to take it away slightly from the shoulder or to push the weapon forward slightly as you pull the bolt back. So that means you've got to get your eye back in and re-aim it very quickly. Whereas with the Lee Enfield, once you're holding it on target, you can just keep banging away, basically.
Yeah. Now, they make 11.5 million. It's a tremendous amount of them. They no doubt I think mine, the one I have, I think probably comes from, I think mine comes from Russia. Mine's captured stock from Russia that's somehow filtered back into this country.
Mine is Portuguese, but again, that's been via somewhere in Germany.
They make a number of changes to these during the war as well. I don't know how obviously visual it is. It's usually the wood, I think, isn't it? Is that right?
That's the most obvious thing. The early ones are quite swish. They use things like solid walnut stocks or solid beech stocks. But as time goes on, they're using almost any old wood and sorts of plywood where they've glued it together to make enough of a block to cut a stock out of it. And while that's quite effective, the ones that are glued together are actually heavier.
Visions of the glue coming unstuck in bad weather.
Yeah, but as we were saying, almost all the changes are to do with making it simpler, making it easier to make. They're not really to do with the performance of the thing.
Because they also have, the Clint Eastwood favourite, the MP40 and the MP38, the submachine gun. Is that a reaction to the fact that the K98 has production? I would say production problems. That's not really what I mean, but it's more of an intricate thing to produce that the Germans decide they need a submachine gun.
No, in that instance, it is more of a combat desirability that applies to the submachine gun, because submachine guns were introduced in the first place for the specific reason of being able to use them in a confined space, like a bunker or supposing moving through a village or something like this. So you can point something very quickly and fire a lot of shots very quickly, perhaps even without stopping moving. Whereas with a rifle, you have to take aim, you have to work the bolt, and then you get one shot. So the submachine gun fills a rather different tactical niche. They had already decided by the beginning of the war that to have a squad leader, or at least somebody in your squad, who had this specialised weapon and knew how to use it in those circumstances would be a significant advantage. So the submachine gun was not just a replacement for a rifle, it fulfilled an extra purpose.
Was it cheaper it's an all-metal construction. Are they cheaper and easier to produce than a rifle with a wood stock and metal parts?
They're certainly cheaper and easier to produce than the submachine guns that predated them. So the submachine guns from the early 30s, most of them were a form of carbine with a wooden stock. So you had to make the wooden stock and then a lot of the pieces were forged rather than stamped. Whereas when you get to the MP38 and the MP40, it's almost entirely stampings, very few forgings, and no wood whatsoever. Even the grips were phenolic resins rather than wood. So you'd effectively cut natural materials out of the submachine guns altogether.
So the Germans come up with the assault rifle. It's in 1944, this groundbreaking weapon. Is the idea with that another way of streamlining their production so they can cut back on the K98s, cut back on the SMG, and just produce one, again, universal rifle?
I think that is what they intended to do eventually, but they didn't actually arrive at that point. I would say we know that's what they intended to do because they'd actually published manuals for the infantry, which transformed the infantry squads into essentially assault rifle squads backed up by a few machine guns and a few rifle grenadiers. So we know that their intention was to scrap the mainly bolt-action rifle-armed units and replace them with essentially assault rifle-armed units.
It's interesting all the way through. So the repeated thing is, what can we save? How can we streamline what we're doing as resources are becoming tight?
If you've ever handled an MP44, you'll know that the stock on that is literally like a plank which has been cut from a piece of wood about 2 centimetres thick. It doesn't feel at all ergonomic. It doesn't really feel like a rifle stock. It is literally the end cut off a plank.
Well, they're liked.
Liked might be putting it a bit too strongly, but people were quickly convinced that having something that you could move around with that had almost the accuracy and distance of a normal rifle and fired as fast as a submachine gun was a good idea. I became reasonably convinced doing a documentary on that one, where we compared a BAR and a Sturmgewehr. I landed up liking both of them, actually, because the BAR seemed to be quite reliable.
You're not quite comparing apples for apples there, though, are you?
No, you're not. No. I would have rather compared the Sturmgewehr with something else. But
there's nothing else to compare, nothing...
Since I had those two, that's what we used.
I mean, there's nothing else really to... I mean, if you compare the BAR and the Bren gun, they're kind of comparable things, but it's just so much more... I guess the closest thing is the
Garand, maybe?
I was going to say like a Kalashnikov or something, which is obviously post-war.
Yes, I feel it would have been unfair from that point of view to compare the Sturmgewehr with something which came in later and had the benefit of people knowing
what they're doing.
Yeah.
what they're trying to achieve rather than, because the Garand again almost feels like a bit of a, for the role it was fulfilling, it's almost like a dead end because the assault rifle went, no. That's not the way to go. Look at this.
And something we've missed out of this discussion, of course, is the intermediate cartridge, because the Sturmgewehr and some of the other later assault rifles, the cartridge is not an old-fashioned full-sized rifle cartridge, and it's not a pistol cartridge either. It's pretty vital to the weapon system, having this cartridge, which is midway between the two. So you can carry more of them. They're powerful enough, but not as oversized as rifle cartridges can be. And they have more inherent power and accuracy than a pistol cartridge.
How are they getting that extra power that more than a pistol? And
it's less than a full-size rifle cartridge, but it's more than a pistol, because the casing itself is larger than a pistol cartridge. It's probably 2 or 3 times the length. So it's less powerful than the rifle cartridge, but much more powerful than a pistol cartridge.
And I guess if you're throwing out a lot of lead, you don't necessarily, you need the, you could get away without having the stopping power. I mean, in fact, you've got that argument between the NATO rounds, haven't you? Where do you want stopping power? Do you want something that injures people, which only creates more problems for the enemy? Injured lots of people rather than killed them.
And there's also the case that if you're carrying more cartridges and firing them more quickly, there's a chance you've hit somebody twice rather than once.
Yes. Yeah. It's Yeah, I didn't really thought of that. Now, conscious of time, but my only other silly question, but I think it's one that people will have heard numerous times. There's the sort of perennial anecdote that Hugo Boss designed the German Army uniforms. Where is the truth in that?
Well, happily, I have the advantage of reading somebody's thesis on that very, very subject, the early history of the Boss family, because, of course, it remains something that's current even to today, with Boss still working as a fashion name. But unlike Russell Brand, I don't believe that Boss actually designed the German Army uniform. And I say that because he was more of a small factory producer who got contracts to produce things rather than doing the basic design work, so far as I can make out.
Yeah, my assumption is that sort of partly the design work happens within the German military somewhere rather than necessarily goes to one of the plethora of manufacturers.
It varies. Some things do seem to be put out to manufacturers to devise, and some things not. The winter uniform, for example, does seem to have been put out to a private company during the design phase, whereas the Feldblues doesn't seem to work that way. They seem to produce samples which are then tried and go round various testing, and the plans are then devised centrally rather than being that of an individual tailor.
So that winter jacket's the reversible, wasn't it? It's camouflage on one side and is it winter camouflage on the outside? So you can wear it either way, and it actually looks like a modern combat. Well, I say modern. Modern, probably circa 1970s, 1980s combat jacket.
It does, and you're quite right. From circa 1943, early 1944, it's reversible. Prior to that, it's grey on both sides, or even grey and white rather than grey and camouflaged.
They must have had specifications, or did they just sort of turn up with a sort of a back of a fag packet idea for a manufacturer? Or how does this? Again, I might be asking a question we don't have an answer to. Do we know how the procurement process for something like that worked? Is it led by the army, or is it led by the manufacturers who are trying to sell something to the army? I mean, I appreciate it's not usually black and white. Often
it seems to work both ways, but with the specific case of the winter combat uniform, the drive was from the army, not from the manufacturers. The army and the relevant ministry office went to the manufacturers and to the suppliers first. It wasn't the case that Neckermann, I think it was, suddenly appeared at an army office with a Parker and said, try that.
I've solved the problem you didn't realise you have. Here you go. Procurement is always, interesting. As I said, I've been fascinated for years about the development of the German helmet, because it's funny, the Stahlhelm, that design, if you look at any modern British or American or NATO helmet, it sort of has its roots visually in that 1916 Stahlhelm helmet with the skirt round. If the Brody helmet was so good, why did we start to replace it from 1944?
I think the key to this is what they thought they were using it for to start with, because as we discussed with the German one, you're covering as much of your head as you can against a variety of things coming from a variety of directions, whereas the Brody helmet was always regarded as a shrapnel helmet. So Brody, his real name was Brody, and he was from Latvia, actually. He was something of an adventurer who went via South Africa and some sort of mining enterprise, and eventually landed up in Britain and changed his name to something that sounded vaguely Scottish. What Brody was aiming for was protection against something which burst above you and showered you with small balls from above, whereas the Germans weren't thinking like that. They were thinking of what's something strong and protective against as many things as possible. Of course, bringing the shell level down to the ears and below was the way to do that. The Germans were also avoiding the French solution, the French Adrian helmet. They got that out very quickly, and it was an awful lot better than nothing. But the Adrian helmet was made in lots of pieces. So if it was hit by something sufficiently heavy, the whole thing just broke up on you, which isn't like a laughing matter, but it's...
I'm not sure how much truth is there in the fact that the Adrian helmet was based around the fireman's helmet, so they had the stamps for it so they could just instantly knock it out. I don't know if that's an urban myth or not.
I don't know the truth of that, but there is a distinct similarity, isn't there, between the comb shape on the top and the little peaks back and front.
Yeah. I've recently been watching Paths of Glory. I can picture the Adrian helmet perfectly. Stephen, as we start to wander away to discuss First World War helmets, that's probably a good place to finish. Thank you. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about German uniforms, Stephen's book is German Army Uniforms of World War II from Osprey. It's a lovely book, and as ever, I will put a link on the website. So that's all from me for now. Next time out, we'll be looking at how to kill a panther. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.